Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this pale blue dot that we all live on. My name is Adamantium, and welcome to this edition of AAU TZM podcast. Just the usual announcement for those of you listening to this on YouTube right now. My podcast also exists on talkshoe.com. Down in the video description, you'll find a link to the call series. There you can download the full MP3 files for free. It is, however, my unfortunate task to inform you that this podcast was brought to you by the Slap Hat, the socially corrective headgear. However, due to a string of legal action taken against the corporation Happy Slapper, which patented the original design, along with distributing them, has now dissolved because the CEO was so upset about the magnitude of the reaction against his product that he hung himself in his loft. Sad story to a rather ingenious product, I think. So this podcast is brought to you by the Real-Time Phonetic Identification Device, or RFID for short. This is a small chip the size of a grain of rice that is implanted under the skin of your right forearm, and it transmits messages to the brain about whether or not the activist that is talking to you is a fanatic or not. You see, there exists a certain confusion in our current thinking as to how to identify those who are objectively pushing their beliefs upon others. And it seems that, biased guesswork is the dominant methodology right now. So it's advised that anyone who isn't an activist should consider purchasing one the next time you're in a conversation. So the next time you're in a conversation with an activist and you start wondering whether it's their presentation that is bad or your own biases, then you'll be able to discern that. So if you go to www.rfidrules.com/AAUTZM and enter the code name TZM, you won't get a discount, but you will get an email asking you why you listen to a self-important activist who's nicknamed after a fictional metal alloy. But anyway, I'm going to get into the meat and bones of this particular podcast and invite back onto the podcast Jen Wilding. So if you'd like to say hello, Jen.
Hello.
Cool. Now, the last time we spoke, we were basically talking about how the encountering of this train of thought initially affected your own worldview and how that sort of spurred you on to do the things that you do. So I thought with this podcast, we would explore how encountering this train of thought has affected or reflected upon your personal relationships, family, friends, whichever if you feel comfortable talking about. And I guess in a nutshell, how would you say encountering this train of thought and starting to embody it yourself has affected your day-to-day social relations?
My day-to-day social relations, I would say it's expanded them because I've met a lot of new friends through the movement and connecting with them. So I know that they support what I do because they're doing it too. So, and that's nice. I think there are definitely different circles of friends that I have, and I have an awareness of their tolerance level of the material. I really try to be sensitive to where they are with the material in the same way that I've talked about in my communication presentation that I did for Z-Day 2012 in Los Angeles, my communication strategies presentation basically highlighted connecting on like values. So it's a matter of knowing what values that friend has that are the topics of conversation that I'm going to be able to connect with them on. And I may not use the zeitgeist movement label at all. They know that I'm involved in it, but I have an awareness that trying to use power or force or intense asserting pressure on someone to change their value system is only going to backfire. Historically, it's always backfired. If you create something that's done by force, then you also, at the same time, simultaneously, though indirectly, create the resisting force, the people who say, how dare you? And it's because it's not a choice. We all want to choose the path that we go down in life to the extent that we can. And, that's why freedom is so high on the scale of what everybody's trying to achieve, even though trying to define that would be very different for every different person you would come in contact with, what that looks like. But basically, I have friends that are within the Zeitgeist movement that are free reign, can talk about anything, and it's very comfortable. And then I have friends that are still very much believers in the current political system, and that if we just vote the right people into office, that all the changes will be made. There are also people that think, the market system is going to correct itself. I let them know where I stand politely, but I don't push the issue if they're not asking questions. And that's the key. I just try to listen for if someone is asking questions that they generally want to know more information about that. I'm happy to talk about that. But if they're not, I don't bother forcing it, because I know that just turns people off to whatever information you're going to present, as if you're going to present it in a way that's forceful or making that person wrong. So that's kind of how I approach communication with it. My family is sometimes more supportive than others. My parents have always supported me as being an activist. They have not taken that much opportunity to really find out what the movement is about, I think for the most part because it's very scary to them to change their views of the world. And so the challenge has been in finding a place of mutual respect there. And I think sometimes it's well achieved and sometimes there's some tension there, because at the same time with my own family, I really don't like being fake with people. And I definitely don't want to be fake with my family. Even though I know that sometimes that would be more agreeable or make things easier to just pretend that I'm someone else. But the reality of it is a big part of my life is supporting and advocating openly and publicly a resource-based economic model. With my parents, I find things that they're concerned about, and I'm able to have conversations about injustices that they're concerned about and ways that I'm concerned about them too, and those seem to go well. My brothers and sisters, not really into it, and that's okay. I get questions every now and then from my sister, but, I let people come at it at their own pace, because it's the only way that it's going to connect with where they are. Like, as long as I've planted seeds and they know, if they wanted to know more information about it, they know where to go. I think that's the best that anyone could do.
Yeah. Because especially when I first came across this information, I was quite fanatical about it, and I would communicate a lot of the time in making statements and transmitting the information. However, I learned that a question is so much more important. When you asking someone, instead of, asserting something to someone, it's far more appeasing to their limbic responses in terms of, how norepinephrine can sort of shut down the critical thinking faculties, and they will react as though they are being attacked because, someone is basically telling them, oh, what you believe in is wrong. and that's what will cause people to shut down if they feel they're being attacked, because, as you said on the previous show, people associate themselves with the system, and they are much more amenable to reacting well if they're being asked a question. And that's why I try more to ask questions than make statements. Because at least with a question, you're not giving the information, you're encouraging them to generate their own answer, or in the very least, you're encouraging them to bubble up that question within themselves.
Yeah, well, a question alone has the ability to interrupt actual neural networks that are just running in loops of the standard thoughts that people have around an issue. If you ask them a question, it actually is an interruption to that pattern. And in that, you've actually achieved something. It's not combative in any way, or it's not a debating position necessarily. It's just legitimately asking what they think about something. And most people are pretty good to if you're wanting to know what they have to say, to give you an answer. And just in the thought process of that, you've created an opening, so to speak, for another possible path.
Yeah. And I've found that it's especially helpful if you at least validate as much as you can. Because, I mean, this is something that Jim Phillips advised me on several months ago, that one of the best ways to get through to someone is just agree with everything they're saying.
Yeah.
So the very act of being that compassionate conduit for more information, if they require it, it's much more amenable to them. And I've found that a lot of the people who I've just shared this information with just offhandedly, you know, and then conversation moves on to something else, I've found that people, like, even after a span of like 2 years, they've messaged me again on Facebook or something, and they said, you know, every now and then I think about what you said, and I'm actually starting to think you got a point. And I'm just like, well,
yeah, that's where the seed was planted, and then something impacted them personally that caused them to remember.
Yeah, and it's just such an unfortunate thing, though, that is the parameters that human beings seemingly have to suffer in order to be able to have that true incentive for positive change. You know, I mean, I just think to myself, why do human beings have to suffer in order to make that realization? Can't we just look at something without it directly affecting?
I'll give you another way in that I don't think they have to suffer. I think another thing would be is there are people that exist in that person's world that they would consider a trustworthy authority. And if that person were to start talking about zeitgeist ideas, whether they call it that or not, they might also start thinking about it. So sometimes it's, you know, you can't take it personally that you weren't that authority for them, but where if they hear the information from the right voice that has been somebody that influences them in other ways, then sometimes that can be where they suddenly think, oh, there must be validity to this.
Yeah.
And it's just where they've put emphasis on, you know, who's their internal mentors and people that they, you know, there's some people that we really admire that we seek out more information from. And even though this movement doesn't focus on people, we're focused on information. The reality is most people are focused on people who they trust to get information from. So I don't think they'd have to suffer. I think there could be another route, and maybe as we get bigger and have more people that have different audiences, when they start to pick up on the ideas and relaying them, you know, whether it's comedians, you know, I think when I see comedians like Louis C.K. or, you know, we know George Carlin, those kinds of comedians are talking about the very ideas of the things that we're talking about and opening up people's minds in a different way. So somebody, you know, who rejects outright us, you know, they don't want to come to a Z-Day, they don't want anything to do with the movies, you know, they have their own ideas about what that is, may completely agree with some, you know, in a comedic context, a joke about something, and it might open their mind to evaluating things in a different way. Like I think there's a lot of power there in art and comedy and music that is one of the reasons why the Media Festival is such a great thing to support as activists, even though it's